Good morning and welcome to the committee's 34th meeting in 2019. Could I ask everyone please to put their mobile phones on silent? The first agenda item is the Agriculture Retained EU Law and Data Scotland Bill. And before I go any further, I'm going to invite members to declare any relevant interest. And I would like to start off by declaring an interest in that I'm a member of a farming partnership. Stuart.
I have a very small registered agricultural holding jointly with my wife from which I derive no income.
And I'm also a partner in a farming business as well.
Okay, thank you. So this item consists of the committee's third and fourth evidence session on the bill, and today we're going to take evidence from two panels. Firstly, the committee will take evidence from the rural policy interests, and then the committee will take evidence from the supply chain interests in the bill. And I'd like to welcome this panel. First of all, I'd like to welcome Pete Ritchie, the Executive Director of Nourish Scotland, on behalf of the Scottish Environmental Link. I'd like to welcome Vicky Swales, the Head of Land Use Policy, RSPB Scotland, on behalf of Scottish Environment Link. Nigel Miller, Co-Chair of Farming for 1.5 Degrees. Professor Michael Keating, Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and Rachel Hunter, the Director of Service Delivery, Highlands and Islands Enterprise. We have a series of questions, and they're going to be started today by John Finney. John.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I'd like to ask a question in three parts, please, about the scope of the bill, please, if I may. People would understand the need for a transitional period between two systems. I wonder, do you support the need for a transitional period for agricultural policy until 2024? Can you comment, please, on the stability and simplicity approach to this transition that was set out in the Scottish Government's consultation? And finally, if I may, please, do you feel that the legislation reflects that approach?
I don't know who's going to go first, but can I just say, if you all look away at the same time, I have a very simple policy. The last person to look away is the one I ask to answer first. But if you want to come straight in, if you just raise your hand and I'll bring you in. I think, Pete, did you, you're going to, now you're arguing amongst yourselves. So, Vicky,
John.
Why don't you head off?
Okay, thanks very much. Yes, Scottish Environment Link does see the need for a transition to 2024. It's quite clear that we need to change in terms of how we deal with agriculture policy in order to better secure the outcomes that society is looking for. And whether we remain part of the EU, and we were thinking about a CAP and the changes to the CAP being made, or whether we are out of the EU and thinking about the greater scope that Scotland has to decide its own policy, it's clear we need to change. We feel that the imperatives of climate change and the nature emergency that we faced mean that we need to get on and make changes very, very quickly. The matter is quite urgent. The climate targets for 2030 are very ambitious and have very significant issues for the agriculture sector. So yes to a transition. We would suggest that we should not extend that transition beyond that 2024 period. We should get on and do it and commit to having a new policy in place if we leave the EU by that point. The stability and simplicity consultations suggested that we would essentially continue with the CAP in that transition period, but would then have scope to make changes to it that would move us to something different in the long term. There is an issue we don't know, and we haven't decided yet, collectively as Scotland, as stakeholders, as this Parliament, what that new future looks like and what that policy is going to be. We have a stakeholder group focusing on that now. That's really helpful, but we do need to get on and decide where we're going, the direction of travel. The stability and simplicity, we have scope to change things in the short term. The problem with the legislation is that it doesn't specify what those changes are. It leaves an open goal. It says for the purposes of simplification and improvements. One person's definition of simplification and improvement is potentially another person's nightmare, arguably. So we need to be clearer about the purposes of why we want to change and the direction of travel.
I'm sure that's going to be picked up on later. Nigel, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, this is
No, Nigel, I would just say to all panel members, don't worry about pushing any buttons. They'll all be done for you. So even when it comes time to cut you off, if I need to, it'll be done for you. So Nigel, off you go.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think that some level of stability over the next few years, when we're in a very uncertain economic climate, seems to make sense. And I think, as given the economic pressures on the industry, is going to be quite important. However, I think there are members within our group, and we try to create a consensus, that are looking for early changes to move us towards our climate change targets. And I think that a step-by-step approach is helpful for everybody. And I think the devices within the proposals, looking at piloting innovative schemes, looks really quite useful. And we would certainly quite like to see soil carbons being focused on, and actually looking at new soil testing standards, so we can actually create a bank of information on carbon, which is a baseline for activity of the future. And there's also technical issues in genetics and waste management, which could be piloted. I think beyond that, I think there are within the maybe not within the proposals, but within the existing CAP scheme, we have a greening element which is pretty unpopular, frankly, and appears to be badly focused as far as Scotland's concerned. If we come out of the EU, there's a real opportunity there to create a mitigation menu which fits with Scottish farming systems and allows land managers to draw down climate change measures or mitigation measures or efficiency measures which suit their system. And from that menu, if they scored to a high enough level, then they would qualify for greening. So it would be a Scottish form of greening which would be actually effective and fit the industry. So I think within the present model, there is actually scope for change.
Rachel, did you want to come in on that?
Well, so High's view is that the sort of stability and simplicity approach is a pragmatic one, I guess, and obviously enables the continuation of current policy and payments. But again, as other members of the panel have alluded to, there is an opportunity to pilot new approaches, which is welcome, and to involve communities, and obviously communities and industry need to be involved in that. I think moving forward, I think we should use this period of time to really think about what rural policy looks like in the future, and I think that the highest view is that we should take thinking from the OECD in terms of best practice in terms of rural development. We're looking at moving away from a subsidising disadvantage to actually trying to maximise opportunities, and considering a sort of triple bottom line in terms of economic, social and environmental objectives. Do you want me to go on, or I can...
No, that's fine. I've got members who want to come in. I was just really looking to John, see if you wanted to develop that further, or whether I should bring other members in.
I think there's opportunities with some of the subsequent questions when those coming, convener. I'm happy to.
Thank you,
I mean, maybe it's coming up later on, but I mean, both Vicky and Nigel mentioned the climate change targets, and the one that worries me more and most is the 75% reduction to 2030. And if nothing really changes in agriculture until 2024, that leaves us 6 years. And to me, that's far too short a timescale to even consider getting there. So my question is the virtual standstill and change for support of agriculture to 2024 realistic, given that climate change figure of in 2030?
We very much agree with that, Peter. We've been using the analogy that this is a contingency bill. We don't know what's going to happen, so it's a bill to give powers, and it's a bit like you're going to go on a journey. So you need to pack a toothbrush, and we're packing a toothbrush for the ministers so that they can be flexible in the future. And then we've put in a spare shirt for the fruit and veg scheme. We've put in some clean underwear for the carcass classification. But we still don't have any idea where we're going. And I think Peter's absolutely right here. We need to use this period from 2020, starting next year, to 2024, to put some pilots in place, as Nigel says, to actually not just try new technical measures, but new ways of delivering money in terms of payment by results, in terms of cooperative approaches to payments. And we need to get all those schemes up and running and the new payments arrangement actually watertight by 2024. We haven't got a minute to wait. And I take Rachel's point, we need to think about this. We've been thinking about this for a number of years, but we haven't actually made any significant changes. And we need to decisively move away from the current pattern towards a pattern of support for agriculture, which does help people thrive, but also does tackle the climate and nature emergency. And we need a sense of urgency here, whether we stay in the CAP or not. And I don't think this bill has any sense of urgency.
Stuart, do you want to come in, and then I'll bring you in, Michael, if I may?
I just wanted to go back to Nigel Miller's comments and just to probe what he means of the things that we need to do, and perhaps the CAP inhibits our ability to do. We know things like the 3-crop rule that the CAP sought to bring was targeted at Mediterranean issues, and whereas Northern European issues are fundamentally different. Is that the sort of territory, or have you got other examples of things that would fall properly in, perhaps not the simplification, but certainly the improvement? I'm just looking for examples, if there are some that are in your group's mind.
I think that there's a whole list of measures which could actually improve the efficiency and the carbon impact of existing systems. And the Republic of Ireland have a mitigation menu that they're looking at, which we've actually kind of, I suppose, stolen some of the ideas from. That portfolio of measures is calculated maybe to reduce the carbon impact of Irish agriculture by 30%. Now, that may be optimistic, but it is a significant move. And the sort of thing that we're thinking of is, precision farming techniques, so soil and crop mapping, so that we actually use our inputs more accurately and less wastefully. Auto steer can reduce inputs by 8% or something. If we look at waste management and fertilizer use and using protected forms of nitrogen rather than the normal urea, introducing clover into swards, maintaining permanent pasture for 7 years or more rather than breaking it up, and avoiding any regeneration of permanent pasture should be done with no-till techniques. Sex semen, using trailing shoes and injection techniques for slurry can reduce emissions by between 40 and 60%, in spreading. So that there's a whole range of practical farming measures that farmers could select from, and that would sit alongside maybe hedge planting and tree planting on farms, and use of break crops and incorporation of carbon into the ground. A whole series of measures that all farmers can actually buy into and actually contribute to.
And so I'm going to bring Michael in, but Nigel, just to confirm, none of those techniques that you mentioned, those techniques that you mentioned, a lot of farmers are already using those in Scotland, are they not?
Absolutely, but not all are, and some of them are not using them at all. And I think this should actually be seen alongside this view that we should actually carbon map all of Scottish farms.
Okay. Michael, you wanted to come in.
Yes, I agree with my colleagues that we should be making some progress on this, but I'll just say a little bit about why that is proving so difficult. One is the question of Scotland's future relationships with the EU, in or aligned or whatever, because there are powers will be taken to align Scotland with the EU regulations on certain things. That might include agriculture. The second one is funding. We know nothing whatever about funding, but we do know that the UK government had given a pledge for funding to the end of the last Parliament, which was supposed to be 2022, and that's now fallen aside, of course. There's a report on funding pending, the Bureau report. We don't know what that is going to say. We do know that the Agriculture Bill, the UK Parliament, proposes to end direct payments in England and Wales. That means overall funding will be going. And then there's a discussion about frameworks in agriculture. We don't know quite where that is. And so we should be thinking those processes should be speeded up a little bit, and so we'll have some certainty in Scotland as to what kind of policy leeway we have and what kind of resources there'll be.
Okay, I'm going to actually, Vicky, I know you could add to that, but I think Mike Rumbles has got some questions which may enable you to do so. Mike.
Thank you, Convener. I'm going to focus very much on post-2024. The policy memorandum which the government accompanies the government's bill, it quite rightly says it wants a new policy in place by that time, and that this isn't a policy bill. This is simply a transition bill to get us to post-2024. But in section 3 of the bill, which is concerning me, it says the Scottish Ministers may by regulations modify the main cap legislation for the purpose of securing that the provisions of the legislation continue to operate, absolutely right, in relation to Scotland for 1 or more years beyond 2020. So my first question really is, what is the danger of leaving this open-ended ability to operate payments? Could it be beyond 2020? If the government's intention is to have a new policy in place with a new bill, why is it writing this? And is there a danger that people see here?
Vicky.
Yes, I think there is. I mean, there's always a danger of things being kicked into the long grass and we just continue with a sort of cap light or cap modified version for many years to come. I mean, our recommendation would be that there's some kind of sunset clause so that this bill says for 1 or more years after 2020 and not beyond 2024, so that subsequent legislation would need to be brought forward and perhaps would focus minds as to what the date is for coming up with a new policy.
Everyone else is looking down. Nigel, do you want to add to that? And then Mike, back to you.
I suppose maybe it's unpolitic to sort of remind you, but the problems of actually producing new administration and auditing software and computer systems are quite large. So radical changes in the system are going to be quite challenging, I think, as far as ARPID's concerned, and maybe quite costly. So maybe some sort of flexibility on the date is required in that respect. Yeah, I think that there is real urgency to actually change. And I think that we probably want good indicators of where we're going to very quickly, because farming takes time to adapt, and we really want to know now where we're going to be 2 or 3 years' time. So I think that there's real pressure to do that. Having said that, I think there is within the present CAP framework. If you look at greening, and if you also look at compliance standards and cross-compliance, there are things you can do, and it may well be that Pillar 2 fills a bigger role in actually driving the changes like.
Mike.
Yeah. My next question really is following on from that, going to section 2 of the bill. It says the Scottish Ministers may by regulations modify the main cap legislation. Now, I'm going to ask you the question I asked other witnesses previously. What does one person's modification of the main cap regulations mean? What does it mean to you? Does it mean just tinkering, as I think it's implied, but can it also mean quite radical change without the need to produce a new bill?
Yeah. Nigel.
I suppose I do have a view on that. I think that nobody can disagree that to improve and simplify things must be good. But the reality is I think we could actually burn an awful lot of time modifying and simplifying what we've got rather than designing the new programme. And I think that's a real danger. And to me, if you're looking at simplification, probably what the main area you want to look at is how we actually audit the system on the ground, how ARPID work and the penalty system, and actually create a more proportionate penalty system and a new culture, maybe using an official advisory service to actually support farmers on the ground, because the existing system isn't the problem. It's actually creating a new culture in farming where I suppose sequestration and other land management priorities are part of their portfolio, and ARPID are going to play should play a really big role in facilitating and supporting that. So we need to change that enforcement culture.
Peter, I'm going to bring you in. I know there's other members who've got questions on funding and how the funding is allocated, so the modification bit would be a good line to follow, Peter.
Okay, we're just picking up on that idea that, yes, we can't simply leave this to one person to decide that this is an improvement. We've got a historic scheme of funding for farming in Scotland, which is not fit for purpose. Most of the £500 million we spend is dead weight in the sense that we have no purposes for that spending, and we have no means of telling whether we're spending it effectively or not. Compared to all other public spending that this place does, we don't know what we're doing with this money. And we would argue that there should be a purposes clause in this bill that says these are the purposes for which the ministers may make grants. And as Nigel says, those should be about supporting this change in culture, helping farmers to do different things. And that should be explicit in this bill rather than implicit that somebody can decide that something is an improvement. we could end up with, as Vicky says, just a cap light, a few tweaks to a scheme which is fundamentally not fit for purpose.
Briefly.
Very briefly, just to say there is, I think, scope for regression. There are things, for all its flaws, there are things within the CAP, important principles, which have been set up about establishing 30% of the budget of Pillar 1 for greening, cross-compliance. Nigel's mentioned quite a number of them. Having a Pillar 2, a rural development programme, which has an agri-environment scheme as part of it. We've just seen a recent announcement to effectively close the agri-environment scheme from next year, made by ministers. You know, there could be some of the modifications that could be made in that interim could be potentially regressive. So it's important that we set the purpose that we want to be progressive and moving forwards with this bill and stopping us going back on any of those protections which are already in the CAP, particularly around environmental issues, I would argue.
Okay, which I think neatly leads on to Richard's question.
Yeah, I actually was struck with Pete Ritchie's comments, and basically it's my view in the last 3 years there's been a phrase that's used very often: let's take back control. So if we want to take back control, let's forget this Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 in CAP. Let's move to a new system called Food Production Scheme, where we actually pay farmers to produce food. I think farmers have been getting subsidies since well before I was born, and quite rightly. So, but again, this bill, some people say we can't change it, some people say we can. The bill gives Scottish ministers powers to modify the financial provision in the legislation. For example, to ensure there's a legal basis for setting up a maximum spend for agricultural support, to amend funds how they're spent, or even how much money is paid to an individual recipient. And I think this is what's worrying people. Am I still going to get what I'm getting just now? I don't think they will, because I think we want to look at something new to try and spread the jam to everybody, so that everybody is paid on food production. Not because, oh, I've got 10 acres of land.
Push you towards a question.
Yeah, well, that's my question is, should payments be made on food production rather than the system we've got now? We're still lingering in Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Can we not develop a new system that is fair to everybody and produces food for the benefit of Scotland?
I'd like to head off on that. Okay, the slowest person to look away. No, Vicky, I think you want to go, but I'm keen to bring in Michael and Rachel on some of these questions. So I'm conscious, Vicky, you're getting quite a lot of airtime at the moment. Vicky.
I don't think the focus should be on food production per se, and in fact, numerous reforms, every reform of the CAP has been trying to move us away from a system that actually subsidises food production, because under WTO rules, that's not something that we are going to be able to do and which we can't do now. It's also quite clear that given the climate and nature emergencies, we need to be refocusing how we think about using this very large amount of public money to support farming. That is not, please don't misconstrue that as to say that farming is not about food production. Of course it is, but it's about what we actually pay farmers for, what the outcomes we're asking them to deliver. There are market goods, food which farmers produce, and there are lots of other goods and services they produce which are not rewarded by the market, but which are incredibly important, and which I would argue actually underpin food production itself and the viability of being able to do that going forward in terms of healthy soils, a stable climate, nature, pollinators, all those things. So I think that's why we need to refocus how we think about how we spend money in the future. But it is about supporting farmers and land management that delivers a broad suite of outcomes we want.
So we're actually going to pay farmers to make their fields greener?
I don't think that's necessarily either what we're talking about here in terms of a future policy.
Should we not be paying them to produce food?
If you can get that through the WTO and subsidise food production, then I think that's going to be very challenging, and that's where we've been trying to move away from and had to move away from in terms of the CAP.
I'd be interested in Mr Ritchie's comments on my comments.
Can I bring you in, Michael? And I've got members stacking up like aeroplanes at the moment to ask supplementary questions. So, Michael, if we come, and then Peter, and then I'll come to you, Jamie Green.
Yeah, well, as Vicky has just said, the CAP has moved from production-linked payments. Scotland is the only place in the UK that still keeps some of those, towards payments on the basis of acreage. And then the idea is to move away from that as well towards something else, towards broader goals. And the problem is what those goals should be. And in England, they're talking about public goods, but they never defined what those mean, except it includes environmental questions. That's probably it. In Scotland and maybe Wales, there may be a broader agenda. It's about maintaining the population, fragile communities. It's about remoteness. It's about the concept of rural policies and rural communities, and the needs of Scotland and England might be different. I think that's where the agenda is now. Of course, there's going to be less money. I think we're going to come on to that in a moment. There will be less money. So it will be important to get those priorities right. But I can't see a move back towards production-linked support for farmers.
Okay, Pete, and then Jamie Green.
Yes, just very briefly, I think, Richard, supporting production, historically led to overproduction. We don't have a shortage of production in Scotland. We're a food exporter. And the danger with any system like that, even if it was legal, is that it generates huge amounts of perverse incentives of people importing soya from Brazil and Argentina to feed cows here to produce a glut of milk, which we already have. You know, so there's a real danger that we go down that production road that, even if we were allowed to do it, I don't think it would achieve the social and environmental as well as economic goals we want to achieve. But I do want to say, and pick up Michael's point, even if we stay within or aligned to the cap, we can be much, much clearer about the purposes for which we're supporting farmers. And I mean, France is a good example here with their agroecology law. They've made it very clear that they're supporting farmers to farm in an agroecological way. And the changes there in the last 5 years have been dramatic as a result of that clarity of what they want to fund farmers to do. Jamie.
Thank you, Convener, for letting me come in at this point, and good morning to the panel. I'd like to bring it back to the legislation before us. We've been talking about the future direction of farming subsidies for a number of years in this room, indeed with multiple stakeholders, and we seem to often be going around in circles, this conversation. This is the only piece of legislation in front of us at the moment with regards to Brexit and the future of farming subsidies. This bill is either a technical bill, which simply allows us ministers to move in transition, or it's a bill that is pointing in the direction of future farming subsidies, or indeed it's a halfway house. And it's a bit unclear as to which of those it is. In your view, what does this bill do or not do, and what would you prefer it to do?
Off on that. Rachel, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, from the highest point of view, I suppose the rural economy is wider than just agriculture, and there's, I suppose, in land-based businesses, there's also, a marine-based economy around our rural areas. I suppose, going back to my earlier point, I think in terms of the bill, it needs to maybe look broader in terms of wider rural economic development, have a more balanced approach across economic, social, environmental objectives. Going back to Professor Michael Keaton's point about addressing demographic challenges in rural areas, depopulation, the need to actually lift productivity and add value to economic activities and look at generating high value employment in rural areas, and ultimately looking at what the opportunities are in terms of I suppose migrating to this climate neutral economy. It shouldn't be seen as a burden, but actually there's so much amazing opportunities around net zero for businesses and communities across the rural economy. So I think looking at sort of best practice internationally in terms of rural economic economy thinking, such as the OECD, the Rural 3.0 report, and also looking at some of the principles and recommendations that's been provided by the National Council of Rural Advisors, I think is really important in terms of moving forward. So I know this is very much says it's an agricultural bill, but I suppose from the highest point of view, we're wanting to look wider than just agriculture.
You wanted to come in.
I think in a sense what we're potentially looking at or hoping for is something which is a bit of a hybrid bill, which points the direction to the future and the direction of travel without spelling out all the details of that because there's work still to be done. And then creating the powers that allow some of those changes to be made that take us in that direction. And at the moment, what we have is a bill which simply creates powers to make changes without setting out why we would want to do that, for what purposes, or in order to take us in what direction. None of that is spelled out currently. If it was possible to amend the bill in those ways to put more of the purpose in, I think that would be helpful.
Would your preference be that we should be looking to amend this bill to do that? Or should this bill be followed by a more comprehensive and robust rural economy / agriculture bill?
I think that second bill will inevitably be required, and that's why I think it's really important that we put a timeline on this bill and don't give it powers to then continue to just roll forward for 5, 6, 7, 8 years if that should prove to be the case.
You say timeline, you mean a time limit?
Yes.
Okay. Emma, you wanted to come in, I think.
It was just to pick up on Richard Lyle's point about food production, but we're seeing that land use is really part of this process of what we need to be looking at. Peatland restoration, tree planting, sheep and trees together in the right places. We're already seeing that Sitka spruce has just been put in certain areas in the borders when maybe a more considered approach should be made. Is that what we're looking at, that this bill should incorporate a more bold approach to agri-environment schemes type thing?
I think that certainly from our point of view, we'd like to see a bolder approach. And I think that there's a section on data which looks at the food chain, but it actually doesn't look at the environment. And I think there's work on land use, but also on catchments from SEPA, and there's habitat maps from SNH. Most of this work isn't actually complete, and it's not tied together, and we need that sort of backdrop to actually focus where trees should be and where they shouldn't be, and what type of trees they are. And as you say, at the moment, we've got a lot of Sitka spruce being dumped in the borders because it's near pulping plants, and in the Highlands we have a lot of deciduous trees being planted. Just for economic reasons, not for habitats or environment or landscape or for any other reason. And if we're moving into an era where agri-environment is going to be more important and there's going to be real pressure on land, for various purposes, and also forestry is going to be a key part of it, as well as food production. We've actually got to have robust ways of actually directing that, making sure that public money supports the right development in the right place, and also looks at multiple uses, so that we open up our forestry support to things like agroforestry, real agroforestry, which actually locks farming and forestry together. So I think your point, I think, is well made and is important.
Sorry, just to clarify that, are you suggesting a move back to zoning based on local biodiversity action plans?
Well, I don't know what you want to call it, but basically, yes.
Okay.
That we should be using those as a backdrop for decision making.
So back to where the plan that we had 10 years ago, which never seemed to come to anything. Maybe. Vicky.
Well, sorry, I was just going to say I think there's a perfect link there that we should be making to the land use strategy and to the commitments that have now been made to establish regional partnerships and produce regional land use frameworks, which essentially do all of those things, kind of look at land use more broadly and in the round and look at all the outputs that we're looking for from land to provide. And actually progressing those things, that's where the sort of strategic planning aspect, I think, comes in, and that would help us identify what we need land to be delivering. And something in this bill that says has to have regard to the land use strategy objectives and principles, and those frameworks would actually be quite a helpful connection to that broader agenda, I think.
And just to add to that, there is a very direct follow-on from the climate change bill, which you've just passed, which sets out very clearly some ideas about whole farm planning and about those integrated functions that farming can perform, including agroforestry, agroecology. All of those things are in the climate bill, are in the legislation, along with regional land use frameworks. And this bill needs to refer back to that bill and continue that bill's work. Because at the moment, this is landing in a sort of policy vacuum, whereas we actually have some policy that we've just agreed on climate change.
I mean, you've got some other questions, I think, that you wanted to ask.
I think we've covered it in a lot about the environment implications of the bill already. So, you know...
You indicated you might want to ask some questions on carcass classification.
Yes. Yep. Okay. So this bill also gives ministers the powers to amend a number of elements of EU common organisation markets and regulations around marketing standards. And I won't really go into detail about carcass classification because other members might, but there's issues around EU food promotion and aid to fruit and vegetable producer organisations to support, I guess, protect against competition law. So I'm interested in any thoughts about how do we support the farmers, so the fruit and vegetable producers, to work together, or there might even be issues with the dairy producer organisations where we already have issues with milk pricing, for instance. That how does this bill support protecting the fruit and veg growers and the dairy producers?
Maybe I can have a stab at that. I think that producer organisations are something which we've failed on, basically, and there's real potential for actually bringing producers together, for I suppose development and marketing their products. I think that that's going to get more important as we move into a world where the world isn't in synchrony. There'll be all sorts of member states or states throughout the world that move at different paces on climate change. And if we're actually going to move ahead quickly on this, our producers are going to be actually operating to different standards and probably different welfare standards as well. Producer organisations, certainly in milk and in the livestock sector, may well be an umbrella which allows those sorts of differentiating standards to be demonstrated, quantified and also marketed. Because there's real dangers. We've talked about food and food production, and at the moment that looks pretty robust. But in reality, in that new world where we may be out of the EU and we've got countries going at different rates on climate change, we've got new international obligations on trading agreements, probably with the US and South America and Australia, where cheap food will come in. We need to have mechanisms that producers actually can market products. And it may well be that supporting food production may well then be an issue, in that we're going to be high-cost producers, basically, if we've got to reduce emissions in various ways. So I think that's important. On the carcass classification, it's not a very sexy subject, but I think there is issues there about efficiencies, and our present classification system actually doesn't necessarily produce carcasses which are ideal for the consumer and for the retailer. We know that certain grades of sheep don't fit with the higher cost grades don't fit with supermarket specs. So reviewing that makes sense. I think also reviewing the classification of veal and young bulls is actually quite important if we're going to have efficiency in our livestock systems, and also produce a pathway for bull dairy calves to be fed. And at the moment we have real restrictions on how those are marketed through the EU.
Pete, do you want to come in on that?
No, I think Nigel's covered it. Thank you.
Okay. Emma, do you?
If we're talking about marketing standards and American trade deals, does our protected geographical indication, so that's for our beef and our salmon and our lamb, is that protected in this agricultural bill?
I don't know. I would hope that it would be, but I think that there is a real concern in the industry that those PGIs will disappear, or will be less, or will not be recognised.
Go ahead. Do you want?
Well, my understanding is that this bill doesn't specifically, hasn't got the ability to protect those specifically, but that this bill brings retained EU law into Scottish law. And Michael probably know better than me about the current state of negotiations in the common framework about PGIs between the UK and the Scottish Government.
I'm not sure if that was a sloped shoulders to Michael, who doesn't want to answer the question, or...
We don't know exactly what the state of play is with regard to these,
okay.
to the framework discussions at the moment.
Jamie, you wanted to come in with some questions.
Well, I do believe I was going to cover those areas anyway. So I'd like to cover the issues of common frameworks and the constitutional considerations of devolved legislation in terms of future policy. There's clearly an acceptance that where regulations are currently held in the EU, once the UK has left the EU, then the repatriation of those to either Westminster or devolved parliaments is an area for discussion and perhaps even disagreement amongst various governments. What do you think the effect of that will be on our ability to put forward legislation which is fit for purpose in this place, given the context of perhaps disagreement between which of those areas or powers that are currently in the EU where should they go to when they do come back to this island?
That discussion is probably pretty much terminated now because the UK government has not taken back any powers, and I can't see any sign that it intends to do so, because it frankly got its fingers burnt when it tried to do that with the initial draft of the withdrawal bill. There are framework discussions going. The indications are these will mostly be non-legislative for practical reasons. Where they're going in the detail, there are detailed discussions in agriculture and other matters, and then there is a separate discussion going on what the UK internal market involves, which could include agriculture as well. And it's surprisingly, these discussions are going along in parallel rather than coming together. No decisions seem to have been taken. And then there's the question raised just now about what happens if there are international trade deals, because that is clearly reserved. What happens if that has implications for agriculture, which is devolved? Again, we don't know. There is another discussion going on about the participation or consultation, probably be a better word, of the devolved governments in international trade deals, including a future one with the EU, plus with third countries. Again, we don't know where that's going. And then there's the big question of money. There's the report pending from Lord Bew on agricultural funding. There will be funding earmarked for agriculture. How much detail there will be in that earmarking, we don't know again. So it's really just open. And then there are questions about WTO as well, because in the agriculture bill, there are powers to determine how the WTO rules will apply across the UK. This bill says in the explanatory notes, it says, well, we're not too worried about that. We're not too worried about what the Scottish Government is doing at the moment, but the power is there. So again, I wish I could give you a clear answer, but all I can say is we thought that things would be clear by now, but as with regard to so much that concerns Brexit, we really don't know. And that's why it's important this committee and other Scottish interests have got to keep an eye on these discussions as they go along, because we don't know where these decisions are going to be made and what the implications will be.
Can I ask a specific question to the panel? One of the piece of evidence we had in previous sessions in this particular bill is that this gives Scottish ministers the power to decide which regulatory environment it wants to align itself to if it's faced with a choice between that of the UK and that of the EU. And they felt that that flexibility was indeed helpful. But does that pose a situation where within the UK internal market you have a divergence of regulatory alignment, and would that pose an issue for the internal market?
Certainly, if the Scottish Government does take these powers, which clearly intended, which is in the continuity bill, which was then abandoned, to monitor, to shadow EU regulations on agriculture and other matters, then the question immediately arises, how does that tie in with UK frameworks? And if those frameworks are non-legislative, we just don't know how that is going to work out. Because that's part of a bigger question, how far is the UK going to diverge from EU regulations? And the bigger that divergence, then the more problem there is within the UK. And we've been looking at that in my centre for 3 years, and we thought we'd be able to tell you the answer to that question by now, but the fact is we can't.
A few other members with questions, so I'd like to bring them in. I'll come back to you afterwards if there's a follow-up. Mike, you want to come in?
Thanks, Commissioner. Yes, I'd like to ask Professor Keating, there seems to be a little confusion here. As far as I understand it, this bill, the UK agricultural bill has fallen. So this bill, dealing with an entirely devolved matter of agriculture, gives the power to take everything back that is currently under EU control back to the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government. Any UK framework to help UK agriculture is not going to be contained within legislation, is it? It's going to be, and if it happens, and I hope it does, but if it happens, it's going to have to be an agreement between the administrations. Is my reading of this correct?
That appears to be the case. The Withdrawal Act still contains that power to take the powers back and therefore to have powers taken back to Westminster. There's also the possibility of legislative frameworks which would be subject to the Civil Convention. We don't know how that's going to work, but my reading of the situation is there probably will be very few of those, if any at all, and the thing will be done by agreement amongst the governments. That's certainly the intention of all governments at the moment. But if there's a conflict, we don't know how that would be resolved.
But this gives the legislative authority to the Scottish Government to do what it wants to do within the agricultural field.
That is the intention for the next couple of years, pending a new bill, which we've been talking about, which would set out agricultural policy for Scotland.
Stuart, you had a question.
Yes, to which I want a really short answer, if it's possible. We've just had a few references to WTO, and I read recently that the US, under President Trump, are not nominating somebody to the WTO, and that might make the whole thing inchoate. And I just wondered if that was something I'd picked up wrong, or Professor Keating, I think, is probably the person who might.
The scope of this bill.
It doesn't, which is why I'm asking for a very brief answer.
Yes.
That is the problem.
Yes.
Okay.
So the WTO might collapse.
Well, I doubt whether it would collapse, but its operation would become more and more difficult.
Right.
And remember, the WTO is not a court anyway.
That's all I wanted in the record.
I'm going to stop that there because the WTO, and whether it's court or not, is definitely not in the scope of this bill. And I've got Maureen who wants to ask a question, and then Richard Lyle. Maureen.
Well, it's also about the WTO because we've mentioned it several times, but are current WTO rules compatible with what we need to do on climate change, or should they be changing? Pardon?
I would say no, they're not compatible.
They're not compatible. Okay, Michael?
I've not thought through that one. I'll just leave that to Nigel. I think
okay, thank you.
Point there.
Richard, you wanted to ask a question.
Keating, I agree that the power in Section 3 of the bill is restricted to modifying the existing CAP legislation, the CAP law that will become retained EU law if we leave the EU. It is not a power that can completely rewrite the common agricultural policy. So there is a substantial restriction on the scope of this power straight away. Would you agree?
It also allows the pilot projects, things to prepare the way for a new agricultural policy. That's in there as well. We don't know what the policy is going to be, but it allows pilots, experiments, testing things out, pending a new policy.
So we don't know what money we're getting, we don't know what power we're getting, we don't know what's coming from the UK government. We just don't know.
Well,
it's like the story of we've got a toothbrush, but we haven't got any toothpaste.
But I think that's true, and it's why it would be very difficult to have a bill containing all that. But what is important, we should have a discussion and statements of government policy as to where they want to go, and what that new bill is going to look like.
I'm going to come back to Jamie Green, and then I'm going to move on to the next question.
And that follows on nicely to my final question, and that's that even if there was a sum of money in the public domain as to how much would be available to each devolved nation for farming support, is it the responsibility of the devolved nation to decide what that support should look like, the rules around which the support is given, given the diverse nature of the UK?
Vicky.
I think it's devolved policy. It's within the gift of the Scottish Government and this Parliament to determine how any sum of money should be spent and for what purposes, absolutely. Now, under EU retained law, there are lots of controls and constraints around that, as we've been discussing, and this bill creates powers to deviate and to move away from that. But essentially, it's a Scottish decision, as I understand it.
And just as a more general point, this time of year when people are finding a lot of money trees to shake, it does seem to me that farming and land use has a huge potential to deliver on our climate and nature emergency. It's the best hope we've got. So this idea that, we're going to end up with much less money, I think is counterintuitive. We should be investing heavily in this transition to a climate and nature-friendly farming and land management system. That's where we should be investing, because we can get a lot of traction in terms of climate change and biodiversity from doing that. So we need to be bold about that, but we do need to set this direction of travel. That's where we want to go.
Angus MacDonald's got the next question. Angus.
Okay, thanks, Convener. Looking at issues raised in the stability and simplicity consultation, and also looking further into environmental considerations, the stability and simplicity consultation states the need for rural policy to better take account of the needs of the environment. Now, we've touched on this at earlier questions this morning, so perhaps you could expand on your thoughts on the environmental implications of the bill, including its ability to support Scotland's approach to tackling climate change and addressing the environmental concerns. So basically, is there anything that hasn't been covered already this morning on environmental implications that you think we should have on the record?
And that's not a 20-page document, I think. But Vicky, do you want to start that off, followed by Nigel?
Yes, so there's scope in various ways, I think, to improve on some of the environmental or greening elements, if we can put them like that, that have already been included in the CAP and to go forward. So we need to think about proportions of funding allocated towards nature and climate-friendly farming. We have greening. It has its faults, but it means 30% of that Pillar 1 budget is spent on measures which should be delivering for both climate and for biodiversity. And we could improve on that. We could think about the shares of money going into those kinds of measures. We've talked about lots of things today about improving advice, for example, the scope to do that. I think we need to look at Pillar 2. We're very concerned about the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme, which, as I mentioned earlier, has been now closed to applications from next year. Those with contracts will have a one-year extension. But that is essentially an Agri-Environment Climate Scheme. It's one of the main funds within the CAP at the minute to deliver on the environmental front. And we're stopping that at the moment, and there's no certainty as to what happens in that 21 to 24 transition period. I think that would need to be looked at. And we haven't really touched much, but I think Nigel mentioned it earlier, cross-compliance. There's a sanction mechanism within the CAP about compliance with existing environmental, animal welfare, food safety legislation which protects in the public interest. Now, the Simplification Task Force, which is largely made up of sort of agricultural interests and representatives, has been looking at that with government as to what those simplifications could be. There's been discussions around penalties and reducing those. Now, I would argue we should be looking at actually maintaining to some extent that kind of sanction mechanism and not going back on that. So that's the sort of no regression point. But actually there are probably ways in which we could also improve cross-compliance going forward to make sure that farmers understand what the things are that they should be doing by dint of regulation as setting the baseline, and everything else then is going above and beyond that and trying to take us forward to delivering against our environmental objectives in a better way. Nigel, do you want to come in on that?
I think I've probably mapped out my sort of vision, and it's probably pretty two-stranded on innovation, one on really revolutionising greening with a menu system. That probably rely or is on the basis that we're likely to be out of the EU. If we're not out with the EU, then we've probably got less wiggle room, frankly, in the present structure. And I guess that looking at Pillar 2 and looking at new environmental and sequestration measures which actually could come into Pillar 2 and how those might be funded, I think is an immediate priority and probably will be important in the next, when we get to the next support system. So I think we want to move on that fairly quickly on that development work and make sure that we have a more robust and deeper portfolio of measures to actually change our landscape and change our carbon balance. But I think that, I reiterate, we've really got to do this on the backdrop, whether it's on regional land use maps or in planning, or whether it's on some other mechanism, some sort of a objective assessment of the environment and habitat, so we do the right thing in the right places.
Pete, sorry.
And just briefly, the idea of capping the largest payments and using some of that money to support pilot schemes, I think, has been floated in the discussions here. We'd like to see that in the bill, because it as Peter says, if we wait till 2024 to make any changes at all to these payments regimes, I think we might well see a cliff edge, which is actually more problematic for businesses than some idea that over the next 3 years, these changes are going to come in. And we certainly need to allocate some resources to the sort of ambitious pilots Nigel's talking about.
Okay, we maybe move on unless you've got a follow-up to that. Colin, I think you've got some questions you want to ask.
Thanks, Convener. Can I turn to consideration of the wider rural interest, which I think there's maybe a danger. We think this bill is entirely about agricultural support, but support through, for example, Scottish Rural Development Programme includes schemes like the Leader Programme, forestry grants, so there's a lot more to support than just agriculture. Can I ask, to what extent do you think the bill adequately provides for the wider rural needs beyond agriculture?
Who'd like to head off on that? Nigel.
I really have no expertise on Leader, because I think it's too difficult for me. So I won't comment on that. But forestry, I think there is real scope for actually reviewing how we plant trees. And at the moment, money is allocated, without regard to other priorities. And we have, flood mitigation sort of strategies that SEPA come up with, and looking at trees in riparian woodlands. They're not necessarily prioritised as far as grant goes, and as I say, we don't, at the moment, we're allocating money to planting really for commercial reasons. And I think that we've really got to get away from that and actually look at appropriate planting and the right planting in the right place. And now looking at different planting designs, so we look at different densities of trees, we look at the fringes, and the Irish are looking at fringes now. At the moment, we still see planting very much, high densities up to the margin. Maybe we should have in larger plantings very light densities for biodiversity reasons near the edges, or even for agricultural reasons to utilise that land. So multi-purpose forestry as well as agroforestry. So new designs available and supported, and making sure that, I guess, in some ways, that the money is spread in a strategic way, and that may well mean that having ring-fenced budgets for different types of forestry, and maybe ring-fenced budgets for forestry on agricultural holdings, to ensure that those levels of planting take place.
Yeah, I think the bill and both the policy memorandum accompanying it are pretty silent, actually, on many aspects of Pillar 2. There's reference to LFAS and to making changes in that regard. But otherwise, it says very, very little about the intentions. And actually, if we think about if we were to remain part of the EU, we would be thinking about having to produce a future, not just plan for Pillar 2 and the rural development aspects of it, but for the whole CAP going forward, as I understand the direction the reforms are taking. So we don't really have a clear sense of what the Scottish Government's thinking is about the future of all those other schemes, including forestry, including Leader, including agri-environment. It really says nothing about it, other than creating powers to change them if they decide to change them. So, it's not very helpful in that regard, I think.
Well, then I'm going to come back to you, Colin.
We've obviously spoken about uncertainty in the wider environment for businesses and communities, but I think there's also a bit of uncertainty of where these sort of Pillar 2 programmes sit in the future, because I know that there's obviously a consultation running on sort of post-Brexit regional funding, the Shared Prosperity Fund, and I suppose it's open to debate whether Leader and other rural development programmes sit within that or sit within this particular bill. I suppose wherever it sits, my role in HIE is about service delivery and meeting the needs of clients and communities. So I think we should make sure that the needs of clients and communities are at the heart of that in terms of where it sits, and also that we ensure there's no duplication and there's alignment across all these different programmes and across other initiatives to support rural economy, such as the enterprise agencies and the emerging deals that are regional deals that are emerging across Scotland as well.
Thank you. Colin, do you want to...
It seems though it's a case of the clock's ticking. I mean, the Leader programme, for example, runs out in months. We're coming to the end of that particular programme, and the bill seems to stress almost stability till 2024. Well, we don't have till 2024 to replace Leader, for example. So, and likewise, the mood seems to be from the panel that we need to be making changes in a whole host of areas a lot quicker than simply waiting until 2025, whether that's around forestry grants. So, is that a case of we need the government to set that out, or is there something practical from the committee's point of view within this bill that needs to be changed and amended to make sure we're making some of these changes that are necessary at a lot quicker pace?
Who'd like to add off? Michael.
Yes, so just to pick up Rachel's point there, I think we've got a proliferation of initiatives, all of which are rather small scale, scattering money around. We've got the city deals, we've got the Shared Prosperity Fund coming in to replace the cohesion funds, we've got ring-fenced agricultural spending probably coming from Westminster, we've got environmental policy. It doesn't all fit together, and the danger is wasting money, things cutting across each other, inconsistent priorities coming from different levels. We need to get a more of a strategic take on all of this. And I'm very worried that not just because this is coming from different bits of government, but these things are coming at different times. You've got one initiative piled on another, and we're going to lose any sense of strategic priority here.
Do you think, therefore, is there something in this bill that needs to, because ultimately what we need to do is determine the legislation. There's a lot of other issues there that need to be determined by us in terms of what we do in the chamber, but in terms of this legislation, is there something in this bill that needs to change that would allow us to get a bit more of a direction and clarity on those areas?
Well, I'd say the bill is a symptom of this tendency to fix little bits and pieces at a time, rather than getting the big picture together and seeing how environment, agriculture, rural development, these things fit together.
Very briefly.
We can do some of that work with the purposes clause. The EU sets out the purposes of the Common Agricultural Policy, and those under a revision. We need to set out purposes for which ministers make grants, and those should include, as Michael says, tackling rural depopulation should be a power within this. You know, decarbonising rural areas should be a power within this. Even tackling rural poverty could be a power within this. But actually being very clear about why are we making these grants, or what are we going to measure success by? And we would certainly argue for a minimum percentage of the grants for the period 2021 to 2024 to be allocated to climate and nature emergency specifically. So that doesn't answer the detail of whether we have Leader or not, but at least it sets out this is why we're making grants.
Okay. I think we maybe move on to Peter. You've got some questions you want to ask Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I mean, I think we've already agreed within the discussions we've had today that the Stability Simplicity document that really sees very little change between now and 2024 isn't what we want. It's too timid and there's no clarity about it. So I think we've kind of settled that bit. But does the panel feel that the bill enables Scottish Government to support land managers in the transition period, for example, through advice, training or other support to help the industry to move forward, even within this stability and simplicity overarching view that seems to be there just now? But what other things can we do? You know, I think Nigel spoke about this, many of that issues earlier on in the session.
I think the advice was a bit of a flagship in the last CAP reform, and that's been rolled out at several levels in agriculture. But I think that the real failure of that is that you tend to hit the same people all the time, and a big sector of the part of the sector is untouched by it. So as a tool for driving change, it hasn't been successful. And I think that we've really got to look at that money and look at it in more in new ways. Certainly, our first priority is to actually look at soil carbons and try and change the soil analysis system, but actually, so we have a baseline of what agriculture is, where we are today. We from headline figures, we look as if we're in quite a good place, but we could be better. And unless we know a baseline, we don't know how we're going to improve that. An advisory service linked to that, which is a one-to-one advisory service, would actually be really important for farmers to understand those results and how to actually manage their situation for the future, because that may be a key way of accessing funding in the future and maintaining their soil carbon and building it. So that's an important point. But I think that also on an official advisory service was ditched in the last CAP reform. My own view is that if we're going to go to a very new type of support system, which is going to look at efficiencies and multifunctional farming, you need an RPID which is light on its feet and actually can facilitate that change. So I would like to see some of the money go into that. And also I think that we want to look at funding for efficiency and sequestration probably at a one-to-one level, so that it's based on a whole farm plan, so that people can actually sit down and redesign their systems and maybe look at their land use pattern and see if they can actually modify that to come up with a better solution. So a totally different form of advisory service.
To come back on that, I mean, I'm a big fan of monitor farms, for instance, and that isn't a one-to-one system what you're proposing there, Nigel. But the problem with them is that the guys that come are the guys that are keen to learn, and the people that really need the help, they never turn up. But a one-to-one system would be obviously better, but it would be hugely expensive, would it not?
Well,
yep. Say that I'm not sure the bill goes specifically down monitor farms route. So yeah. I appreciate you may have your views, and I'd like to bring Vicky in very briefly on the issue of advice, if I may, which was the first part of your question, because you wanted to come in.
Just to echo Nigel, really, I think we see it as a Scottish Environment Link as a really, really central part of a new system going forward, and there is scope within this transition period to actually improve the advisory services. There are already measures within the CAP. We actually have seen the budget for advisory services cut in recent years, not increased, so there's an issue there which could be addressed. We know from our own work that we do as RSPB Scotland with farmers that greening, for example, which has had a lot of criticism, when farmers get good advice around how to use ecological focus areas, for example, they can actually deliver some really great things for some of our species which are in trouble. So it's absolutely fundamental to this. There's also scope for cooperation and collaboration, doing things at landscape scale with farmers, which could be part of pilots. Again, under EU rules, we could have had what was going to be called the ECAF scheme, Environmental Cooperation Action Fund. We made a mess of the proposals, the EU ruled it out, it hasn't happened. We could go back and actually do something like that in an interim, which would actually be quite helpful as well.
Just briefly.
Well, the one other bit I was going to touch on is there any implications within this bill for food safety and animal welfare issues as well? I mean, is there anything in there we need to think about?
Is it protected enough, Vicky?
Well, again, that probably takes us to cross-compliance and the whole system of regulation, EU regulation in relation to environment, food safety, animal welfare, phytosanitary standards. And cross-compliance was introduced as a sanction mechanism because compliance with those laws and regulations across Europe as a whole was not deemed to be adequate. And one mechanism was to say to farmers, you face penalties if you do not comply, and we'll introduce an inspection system. Now, I'm not saying that system in itself is perfect, but the principle of that is quite important. And I think there will be probably some pressure if ministers have powers to change some of these systems to reduce things. The Simplification Task Force I mentioned has already been looking at things around penalties and inspections. Now, some of those things may be really helpful, you know, not penalising people if your cow's just lost an ear tag. You know, it's not in the grand scheme of things. You need to replace it, of course, but, you know, it's not the end of the world. But there are other aspects to that which are quite important and do need to be enforced. So we do need to be careful that we don't go backwards on that system, that actually in a way we go forwards and improve on it. So SEPA, just to give an example, have done a lot of catchment walking, particularly looking at breaches of the general binding rules where there's some crossover with cross-compliance, and found a breach per kilometre. Now, some of those were relatively minor, some of them were much more serious. And they were giving quite a light touch approach to penalties. They're now, as I understand it, reviewing that approach and ramping it up a little bit again, because actually there hasn't been compliance to the level that they need to. So we just need to watch that.
Thank you. I think we'll leave that one there. Going to go to the Deputy Convener, Maureen. Maureen.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, panel. When we had the Bill team in, they suggested that they might want to make changes to the Alpha scheme and indicated that they're still working on a new areas of natural constraint approach. I wondered if you felt that this change is appropriate, or were you expecting other changes to LFAS support in this bill?
Who wants to dive into this difficult area? Nigel, do you want to?
I think it would be inappropriate, given my past role, to actually make any comment on LFAS. I mean, it's obviously a key area, and I think that given the economic pressure on these sectors at present, it's absolutely crucial that it's solved in some way. But,
Vicky, do you want to?
Yes, and don't want to take lots of airtime, but yes, I mean, we have been involved in discussions around LFAS for a number of years. The first thing I'd like to say is that it's absolutely important we recognise that farmers who are farming in pretty difficult circumstances on marginal land and some of our more uneconomic farming systems need support. So we're not arguing against that. What we've always argued against is that the current LFAS scheme is not delivering the best kind of support to the farmers who most need it. And there's quite an overlap with farmers in those areas from an economic perspective with some of our most important environmental areas, what we would call our high nature value farming areas. And all assessments of the scheme show that the money goes to the wrong places, that most of the funding within that 65 million pot as it was until relatively recently goes to the better quality land in the LFA and not to the most disadvantaged land because of the grazing categories and the weighting system. The EU proposed making the change to an ANC scheme, which was areas of natural constraint, still not a perfect move in terms of how you best support farmers and crofters in these areas, I would argue. It's tricky in a transition period. Do we move to something completely new, or do we think about how in the longer term we better support farmers in those areas and therefore continue with the system which is imperfect, but it gets money to certain places. And I'm not sure we've necessarily got the answer to that, but I think it needs looking at quite quickly and some decisions to be taken about how we best deliver the money to the places and farmers and crofters that most need it, but also try to make sure it ties then in with the environmental and climate emergency issues that we're facing at the moment.
Maureen.
Okay, so in terms of that, and also any other of the pilot schemes that are on the go at the moment, have you been consulted on these formally or informally as to what might be and what should be, or have what consultation has there been with farming organisations?
Vicky, you can answer that for the record. You were shaking your head.
Well, I think it's been partial and incomplete, and on some issues around some of these changes, which this bill would allow potentially, there's actually, I think, been pretty poor consultation or engagement with the breadth of stakeholders, I think, that need to be engaged in these discussions. So I think could do better would be the message going forward on quite a number of fronts, and for it not to be behind discussions behind closed doors or only with certain parties as to what the changes should be.
No, I don't know, Rachel, you're next. Nigel, did you want to come in just? No. Okay, you're staying out of this one. Rachel, followed by Pete.
Yeah, I mean, from High's point of view, we work with clients in some of the most remote and rural and fragile areas in Scotland, and these, can cross over to areas which are supported through these less favoured areas schemes and so on. I think, going back to my earlier point, I think in terms of moving forward, we need to think about the wider opportunities in these areas in terms of, I mean, I've worked in High for 16 years now, worked with a lot of businesses over that time, and I think the most transformational things that the public sector can do is actually support, collaboration, leadership, personal development, investment in human capital. So think about entrepreneurship, how we can do things differently, what opportunities there are. So I think it's not just looking at the land, but looking at the community and the place in the round and what opportunities there are to support that and develop and grow that particular community or crofting or business. Yeah.
Pete, before I come to you, I'm just going to bring in Richard Lyle, see if you can answer that one as well.
Interesting what Vicky Swales was saying there, and again it comes back to what I said earlier. So we really need to devise a system that takes in climate change, forestry, farmers, all types of farming, greening, in order to improve. Am I correct in saying that? Yes.
Broadly, yes.
Yes. That's
we need
fine.
to deal with all those issues.
That's fine. Thank you.
Pete, you wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, so two things. One was a general point about we do need to be clear about what we count and measure when we're trying to work out whether any of these policies are effective or not. And I think when we leave the EU, if we leave the EU, we've had at least some reporting system back to the EU on what are we doing with the money and where's it going. If we're doing this ourselves, we really need to be much clearer as a country on what are we spending the money on, what are the performance indicators, how well are we doing, and whether that's, as Rachel says, how many farmers have had some sort of CPD in the last year. We don't have a lot of those numbers to hand, and we don't agree on what it is we're trying to measure, what counts as success in this area. So as a general point on measurement and monitoring. But I think I'd also like to say on Maureen's point about the consultation, I'm not saying that DEFRA has done things great, but there has been a much more open process about saying what should we pilot in the next couple of years, and a lot of conversation about that. Certainly from the environmental organisations, I don't think we've had a lot of contact to say, what do you think we should be piloting 21 to 24? Because time's marching on.
You want to come in now?
Just really to support your concise view of the world, which is you're looking at a multifunctional sort of support system, for your land use or farming, which actually delivers on all these objectives. But I think that it's worth remembering that income support is part of that, and that that was one of the reasons that the CAP was developed originally. And if you look at Scottish statistics, only 30% of farms actually can make a profit without direct support. If you look at Hill Sheep at the moment, they're losing £3 a head probably on sheep, and the average incomes, I think the last published ones are about 11,000 a year. So
farmers hand over fist.
Sorry?
We're losing farmers hand over fist. So
and I think that may well increase in number as well over the next few years. So I think there is a real challenge there in creating a future for farming.
I'm going to come back to Maureen.
Just a comment. I'm presuming you're all welcoming then the Women in Agriculture Task Force in terms of leadership and CPD and new entrants and things.
That is definitely outside the scope of this bill, but Emma, you wanted to come in briefly.
Yeah, it's just to pick up on Pete Ritchie's point about we've got 85% LFAS land in Scotland. It's completely the opposite in England. So we have pilot schemes that probably need to be hurried along, get going, just get on with it. Does this bill enable pilot schemes of whatever we choose to support production environment, farmers that are in the worst areas? I know a tatty farmer that's getting LFAS land in LFAS in Borders. He's grown potatoes in the Borders, but he's an LFAS farmer. So how does that work? So I guess maybe a wee bit of a tangent, but these schemes or pilots that we have, we really do need to get on with them and get going.
I completely agree, and I think the bill enables ministers to get on with them, but it doesn't direct ministers to get on with them or explain what it is we want ministers to get on with. And I do think there's an opportunity, picking up Jamie's point, for a sort of hybrid bill that at the very least sets out a very clear process over the next 21 to 24 period.
John Finney, I think you've got some questions.
Thank you. Yes, panel. The definition of agricultural activity that's used at the moment is one that's set by the European Parliament, and I'll not read it out to you, I'm sure you're broadly familiar with it. Now, the bill gives the Scottish Government the power to amend that, but the bill team tell us there are no plans to amend. I wonder if you have thoughts on that power, and indeed whether the definition should be changed or scope for a broader definition or an alternative definition.
I think it's worth looking at. I mean, I think the power to amend it is probably appropriate. I mean, it's had some contention in the context of the CAP and trying to exclude certain people from being able to claim cap payments who were not legitimate farmers and to try to tie it to agricultural activity as far as possible. But as we've just had a discussion, the other bit of the cap pillar 2 also leaves it open to payments being able to go to other land managers, because that includes forestry payments, for example. It includes environmental payments and other things which are not always necessarily just going to farmers. So I think it's going to be an important thing to think about in future, given the multifunctional land use and agriculture we're looking for, who the beneficiaries are and who is eligible to make claims for payments. So, and that sort of goes back to, I think, that definition of what we mean by agriculture or related land use in that context.
You know, I'm not that far away from where Vicky is. I mean, I think that, you know, that it was a very contentious issue in the last cap reform, trying to ensure that you know, money wasn't siphoned off onto land which was really abandoned almost. And I think that is still a real risk, so that having a robust agricultural activity, and maybe it needs to be more robust, with a threshold in it so that you can't ghost farm. You know, I think that is true, but I think Vicky's also right in that in the world we're in, you know, whether it be agri-environment or you know, special conservation areas or forestry, these, you know, come out of that budget, and your status, you can be a non-farmer to draw those down onto land, and that would make perfect sense to do that, even if you're out with the core agricultural support. And I think that's would actually facilitate the sort of multi-use countryside that we want to see. Like,
yeah, from a funding body point of view, you know, having that list of agricultural product definitions can be quite restrictive. I mean, going back to earlier, what we try to do in High is look at outcomes, you know, what in terms of socio-economic outcomes, and sometimes you can present it with quite a good business case for a particular food product or added value food product, and then because it doesn't fit a certain criteria or list, it has to be knocked out of certain support schemes. So I think going back to the earlier sort of the general point that I think the panel is making about, you know, we need to know where we're going, what the outcomes, what are our priorities moving forward, and focus on that as opposed to, you know, defining lists of what are agricultural products and what are not. I think we need to look at the wider outcomes for our rural economy across Scotland.
Yep, Pete.
Yeah, and the earlier point, you know, I would agree. I don't think narrowing down or changing that definition in the short term is what we need to do, but we do need to think about how we produce high quality food in Scotland while supporting nature and while tackling climate change. That's our goal. As you said, we need a multi-purpose scheme, and that does include already things like the Food Processing Marketing Grant, which isn't about primary production. We'd also like to see more support for urban agriculture, which has big social outcomes as well as some environmental outcomes. So I think as we develop the next stage of the bill, we want to have that discussion about what are we trying to achieve with agriculture and food production in Scotland, what's it all for, and get that second bill as good as we can make it. But I do think we're probably not in that right space now. I think we need to get a good hybrid bill now and then spend time on the 2024 bill.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's all the questions from the committee. I would like to just ask one, just as a summary at the end. I mean, I think it's been a very interesting session that we've seen, talked about the need for dealing with environmental issues and climate change, and the need for food production, and the need perhaps to shift money from food production to the environment to encourage that. There will be some implications of shifting money from food production to the environment, and in fact it may well increase the price of food. My question is, am I right in thinking that what you're saying is the bill gives a whole suite of options for the government, but you are concerned that the government may use it and not go to the next stage, which is coming up with an agricultural policy for Scotland? And we as a committee ought to be looking at making sure that the bill is limited to ensure that we get on with coming up with an agricultural policy for Scotland. Or have I misread that? And who'd like to head off on that? Nigel. Oh, Michael.
I think that's a fair summary.
Michael, do you want to add it?
And I said, that's a fair, what you said is a fair summary.
Okay. Nigel, sorry, do you want to add anything?
I certainly wouldn't want this bill to stall progress in any way. I think that the next stage is absolutely crucial, but I think there are devices that within this bill for meaningful pilot work and meaningful changes which could actually set us on the right trajectory, and I don't think those should be ignored. I think part of this bill there should be, whether it's an annex or whether it's a totally different article, there should be some sort of framework for change that is associated with it.
Vicky.
I think it's that, and making sure that we don't create the powers for things to be done inadvertently or purposefully, which actually take us backwards rather than take us forward. So just to watch that as well.
Okay. Pete, do you want to add anything?
I absolutely support that framework for change and a process by which government reports back on that progress over the next 3 years, so we know we're moving forwards.
Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, as I said at the beginning, it's a pragmatic approach because it probably gives some sort of certainty for a period of time, but there are bigger fish to fry here in terms of the sort of the macro rural economic development policy for Scotland. Yeah, so I think I would generally agree with the panel. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank all of the members of the panels for coming along today and giving evidence. And I am now going to suspend briefly to allow the panel to depart. Full committee members, could I ask you to be back here at 10:35, please? Okay, thank you. I'd like to move back into session now, and this is our second panel of evidence this morning, and I'd like to welcome the panel Martin Morgan, the Executive Manager of Scottish Association of Meat Wholesalers, David Meekie, the Deputy Director of the Soil Association Scotland, and Sarah Miller, the Head of Industry Development, Quality Meat Scotland. And we have some questions for you, and the first set of questions coming from John Finney. John.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I'd like to ask a question in 3 parts, please. It's the same one I asked to the previous panel, and that is, do you support the need for a transition period for agricultural policy until 2024? And as regards the approach taken by the Scottish Government in its consultation, the stability and simplicity approach, do you have comments on that, please? And finally, do you feel that this legislation that we're scrutinising reflects that approach?
So I don't know if you saw the start of the last panel, but basically, if you want to leap in and answer the question, just indicate, and I'll come to you. If you all look the other way, the last person to look away is the one that will be answering the question. So David wants to start off. David.
Yes, I think we absolutely do need a transition because we've got some big challenges. We've got the Climate Act, which is committed to 75% emissions reduction by 2030. We also know that farming is not very profitable, and there's also a wildlife crisis. There's lots of issues. And also with farming, you certainly, I would say, need a transition because it's quite a long game. You need a lot of planning, and it takes a while. So yes, I welcome the transition, but we need to know where we're transitioning to, and also it's very important that there's an end date to this transition as well. So I would say 2024, and then we go somewhere after that. Within the simplicity and stability consultation summary, there was some of the respondents said multiple answers stressed the need to have a clear and coherent vision and strategy of what the end of the transition phase will look like in order to avoid using the transition as a means to stall decision making. So I think, yes, we need this transition, but we need to know where we're transitioning to, and we shouldn't be kicking the can down the road until 2030.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I would certainly agree that we need a transition period, and that we need to have a plan in place to where we want to get to. In terms of the bill itself, we would like to have seen the Scottish Government and the ministers take a more ambitious approach to revamping the existing rural development programme and the many schemes that sit within it to better reflect what Scottish agriculture in its totality needs today.
John.
Thank you. Maybe hear from Sarah, and I'd particularly like to hear whether, with regard to the consultation, the stability and simplicity, if you feel what we have in front of us reflects that approach. Thank you. Sarah.
To pick up from the rest of the panel, absolutely support the need for a transition period. As David said, farming is a long game. You put a cow in calve, it'll not be for 2 years or so until that calf actually enters into the food supply chain. So decision making isn't overnight, so we need to be thinking long term. The name of the consultation that was put out was Simplicity and Stability, and linked to that long term game, the other major driver on farm that often isn't talked about is cash flow. So cash coming into farmers' bank accounts at certain points of the year, particularly again because you either sell the majority of your lambs or calves or cereals at certain points of the year. That stability of cash flow and certainty in that helps give farmers confidence, and also gives lenders confidence in the farming industry. So a piece of legislation that enables that is hugely beneficial for the farming industry. That being said, I agree with both what Martin and David said about the need for a forward look post 2024, and there are plans afoot with the Food and Farming Production Group to take that forward and to look at the longer term challenges within that. But apart from that, this bill does do what the consultation set out to do, which was to give stability to farmers and to simplify some of the legislation that comes from Europe.
David, yes. In terms of stability and simplicity, I understand the importance, but farming, I'd say, in Scotland is quite fragile at the moment. We don't want to have a fragile stability. We should use this transition period to build more resilience within the sector and to create the sort of outcomes, the farmers to produce the sort of outcomes that we need to see, which is not, yes, it's producing food, but it's a whole suite of other things as well. And in terms of the consultation summary, I've got the summary in front of me. So continuing with the old EU approach is mostly disfavoured. And this one is kind of a cut and paste of the old EU approach. So yes, we need to enable, we can't let the wheels come off the bus. You know, we need to enable payments to be made to farm businesses because that's absolutely essential. But with the scope to simplify and improve it, we should be able to do that to kind of move away and move towards something. But the danger is we don't really know what the intent is behind it. So we've got to be clear on what we're simplifying and improving to do and what we're transitioning to.
Add anything? You don't all have to add something. So if you think it's been said before, that's absolutely fine. But Martin, do you want to add anything to
No,
that?
I'm fine for now. Thank you.
John. Okay, the next questions are from Mike Rumbles. Mike.
I'm going to ask basically the same questions I asked the previous panel, that we know this is an enabling piece of legislation. It covers the transition period until the intention is to 2024. But when we look at the wording of the bill in section 3, it does say it will use, ministers may use regulations to modify the main CAP legislation in Scotland for 1 or more years beyond 2020. So, I mean, you mentioned kicking the can down the road. Do you think we could be in a situation? The intention of the government is to bring a new bill, a policy bill by 2024, but they don't have to, according to this. What are your comments on that?
Was it your expression, can down the road, or was it yours, Sarah?
I'm not sure, I think it was mine.
I'll take the credit.
David.
Yeah, I think there needs to be, I think there needs to be an end date, essentially. I finished agricultural college and went and worked on the farm. At the time, production was decoupled from support, and we completely changed our business. Got rid of all the cattle. I had to get a job. Actually, since then, agriculture hasn't really changed. There's been a stasis, and I think with farming there has been this kicking the can down the road from the EU. And I think that there's a danger of doing that by saying, you know, farmers, they're having a hard time, it's difficult, we need stability. But what are we stabilising? Are we just having sort of fragile stability? We need to think about how we can move forward as an industry.
Sarah.
I think the pragmatic part in me says we can't be kicking the can down the road. However, we've seen over the last 3 years we'll call it the legislative and political changes that we've seen in Scotland and in the United Kingdom. So actually what this bill would give us is a bit of certainty in that should circumstances change again, there is legislation in place that stops the wheels from coming off. That is my pragmatic view on what that does. And I think as long as that 2024 piece comes afterwards, which I'm confident that it will, this is justified.
Martin, if you want.
Yeah, well, certainly taking on what David said, that there is a lack of change in farming, and there is a need to modify that. There is a need to speed up the process of change and the adoption of new technologies, new practices on farm to make that farming operation far more efficient than it is now. I think I heard Nigel refer to you guys in the earlier session that only about a third of farmers are actually profitable without support. We need to up that percentage big time. We need primary production. If you don't have primary production, you don't have processing, you don't have an end product. Farming is about food primarily. There is obviously an environmental dimension to it that needs to be protected and enhanced. But we really, as I said earlier, we need to see a little bit more ambition from the Scottish Government and how it seeks to modify what we have at the moment and then put in place something that's even better in their next bill.
Sorry, that I do agree with what Martin said, but purely around the question of is the legislation required that allows ministers to have that change for 1 year or more. I just think that does give us the flexibility in there. So.
Question, it gives the flexibility. That's the whole point of it. As I'm saying it, I know and we know the policy as announced by the Scottish Government. They want a new policy in place by 2024. They've set up this group from the new food and farm policy. It's going to report in June next year, and then that will hopefully provide the work for the minister to come forward with a new a new agricultural bespoke policy for Scotland. This isn't the bill to establish that. This bill is the transition bill. But my concern, I think concern of some of us, is that the way this is actually framed, while giving the flexibility, does not insist that the government, by the way, post-2021, it could be any government, it could be a different government, could come in and then say, well, actually, we don't need that. We don't need to do that because actually we can operate in regulations without even producing a new bill. Any thoughts on that point?
David.
Completely agree. Yeah, it needs to be a sunset clause. I think there needs to be an end date. I think if Brexit's not done by then or whatever, and there needs to be another bill or an amended bill, then okay. But I think it's very important that there's an end point.
I mean, before I bring the other.
Yeah, and it's just following on from Mike Rumble's points, and I'm not sure how many of you were in the last or heard the last session, but there was a suggestion that actually the committee and members thereof could strengthen this bill to make it more of a what was called a hybrid bill that sits somewhere between just a technical transition bill and a future long-term agricultural policy bill, and we could strengthen it by adding some policy objectives to it. Do you think that would be a wise approach, or is it better to treat these as separate pieces of legislation, one for transition and then demand of the government a future long-term policy?
I'd like to head off on that. Sarah, do you want to go on that?
I can see actually why that hybrid bill would be welcomed, because it does, and I think to have a transition you do need to know what you're transitioning to. So I would completely agree with that sentiment. Yes.
David.
So I may be wrong, but my understanding is that they can make simplifications and improvements to this, which would allow for. I think there's quite a lot of scope to change quite a lot. But we need to be important in know what we're simplifying and improving to do. At the moment, my idea of an improvement is maybe quite different to Sarah's idea of an improvement. So I think it's really clear that it's got to take into account the wider Scottish Government policy outcomes it wants to achieve, including the Climate Act with the 75% emissions reductions by 2030. My concern is, go back to kicking the can down the road. You know, we're here in terms of emissions in farming. We need to be maybe here or here in 2030. There's a danger that this just keeps us on an even keel, and then farmers have a huge mountain to climb in those last few years. So I think the intent or where we're going to, that allows those simplifications and improvements to be made in the right way to do the right things.
An upwards direction, saying there are
so it's difficult because we went to emissions reduction, but I like the analogy of the farmers having a mountain to climb. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think we'll move on to the next question, which is Peter's. You've got some questions.
It's around the same subject, but I mean, the intention of this bill is to make minor changes. That's what we're told, and that any long-term rural policy changes will be via new primary legislation. But do the panel have any views or concerns on the extent of policy changes that the Scottish Government may introduce using secondary legislation using this bill? I mean, we've kind of explored that, but is there any other to add to that query? No.
Martin.
Yeah, I attended a stakeholder meeting last week with the government officials, including the people drafting the bill, etc., who I think have already appeared before you. And it was alluded to then that they are developing proposals internally to revamp some of the schemes, modify them in line with these powers, but there was no detail whatsoever on what these changes may be. And there was an indication that stakeholders would be informed in due course, but there was no sort of timetable outlined as to when that might be. And obviously we know the main group, the other group, is due to report by the Highland Show next year. So, you know, there's a fairly short window of opportunity for stakeholder groups to actually offer any meaningful comments on what these proposed modifications may be.
Okay, I mean, that's fine. I mean, during the consultation to the stability and simplification scheme, there was many comments about preparing for longer term changes up to 2024. So where would you expect rural policy in Scotland to be at the end of the transition period? What changes would you expect to have been introduced by then? I mean, this is following on just from what we were speaking about just now. What should we be doing in the meantime to move the industry forward up to the 2024 deadline, and then, you know, set the scene for going forward further?
Martin, do you want to lead off? I mean, you suggested that farmers need to become profitable. Do you want to sort of develop on that, or there are...
Yes, certainly. I mean, there's plenty of tools out there that farmers can deploy to improve their operations. We've seen that in the Quality Meat Scotland Enterprise Costings, where the top performers are much more adept and up to speed on the technical aspects of their farming operation. This needs to be rolled out across the entire industry. It has to be embedded in every farmer that they are monitoring their key performance indicators. They are adopting best practice, they're being innovative, they're taking, you know, what's happening in research studies onto their actual farming enterprises to improve their overall performance, both economically and environmentally.
Do you want to add to
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that so the last CAP had a lot of focus, or the current CAP still has a lot of focus on advice. And you can give people lots of advice, but they don't necessarily have to take it. So I think there should be a piece about capacity building, enabling, empowering people to figure out their own solutions to their own problems, to make that transformational change that is required. I think there's something about, you know, not maintaining this sort of fragile stability, but building resilience within the sector. Because I think that whatever happens, we don't know what's going to happen with common frameworks and budget allocations and all these things, but I think we need to get folk ready for a world in which the support just isn't there, and know how to be profitable, know how to use diagnostics, be financially literate, know about reducing, about minimising fixed costs, and, you know, all the other good things that the good farmers should be doing. But then also there's something about increasing output, and output doesn't necessarily just have to be food. Output can be carbon, it can be clean water. There are wider ecosystem services and social value that our land can provide, and there should be a sort of a step to move towards that as well.
Okay, Sarah, do you want to come in briefly? I'd like to then bring in Maureen.
Yeah, so I suppose key for me are both profitability and communication in the supply chain, so not just at farm level, but profitability all the way through that piece, because without actors within the supply chain, processors, etc., that doesn't give a demand for products produced at the farm gate. The big piece that we've been talking quite a bit recently at QMS is about communication within the supply chain, and how, for example, the data revolution and AI in particular could actually give farmers the evidence base from which they can then make decisions quicker and more informed decisions, particularly when we look at the livestock sector and I suppose, a fragmentation between the store calf or store lamb producer and the finisher. So anything that we can do to give data and information back to farm gate, which is an area accelerating at a very fast pace, would be beneficial and could set us up both to meet the challenges proved by the climate emergency and the wildlife crisis, and having those data sets on farm could be transformational. That's the big key piece, I think.
Maureen, you wanted to come in?
Thank you, Convener. We talked in the previous session, or we kind of mentioned whether WTO rules were climate change compatible. I just wonder whether you think the demands of the supermarkets are actually compatible with climate change, and whether, you know, they want the fat content to be this, that, they want the age to be this, that, whether that is compatible, and whether supermarket demands might have to change in order to help with climate change.
David, I'm going to come to you first and then Martin.
Yeah, so I think there's definitely something to be done there. There was an earlier session about food production, and we should be paying farmers to produce food. I actually think that food, the market should be fairly paying farmers to produce food, and there's all sorts of other policy levers that can be pulled to try and enable that to happen, so that multiple retailers are perhaps paying a better price, or there's more cooperatives, so you're addressing this very asymmetric supply chain that we have in Scotland and the UK. Yeah, I think the supermarkets could be doing more on climate change as well, absolutely. But I think that if we're thinking about land and rural and how we're supporting land, what are the wider outcomes that we get from that? And that's, you know, the things that there perhaps isn't a market for at the moment. And then the things that there is a market for, which is food, we should be ensuring that farmers are getting a fair payment for that food.
Okay, Martin.
Yeah, thank you. They're often portrayed as the villains in the piece of supermarkets, but in actual fact, you know, they just reflect what the consumer demands, and they are passing that demand back on to their suppliers. So I think it's really a question of educating consumers rather than the retail.
Supermarkets can't manipulate consumer demand, surely.
I wouldn't possibly comment on that.
Just to add, sorry, to what Martin said there about, I would agree that supermarkets in particular reflect what consumers are looking for in my experience. But one area that we've not spoken about is at farm level. I suppose it's this connection between farm level and what supermarkets do. Farmers are paid on the beef sector in particular by the Europe grid, which is a grading mechanism. This legislation would enable us to change that, and there's also a specific reference in this legislation to bringing in potentially carcass grading on lamb carcasses as well. So these are factors that reflect back the payment which farmers then get. So if we can manipulate those, we can then produce the products that would go into supermarkets and other routes to market as well, that can then influence what we do on farm. So there is a mechanism there, and there is an opportunity within this to look at what we do next with that, which is something that we would definitely welcome.
That's very annoying, Sarah, because that's a question I wanted to ask later on, but because you brought it in, I feel now is the time to mention carcass grading. You've mentioned the importance of it. I mean, farmers know the importance of getting an animal ready for slaughter as quickly as possible, and getting the balance between fat and meat content. And Martin, you mentioned about the importance of supermarkets demanding what they need. Sometimes getting more meat and less fat gives less favour and requires a higher energy and protein mix, which therefore affects the environment. So you've suggested, Sarah, that carcass grading needs to change. How will you make sure that it works if the government wants to do it? How the government makes sure it works for everyone involved?
So for me, that's that communication piece throughout the supply chain. So QMS has done a piece of work in this in the past, the IMEC project, which completed, I want to say, in 2013. I'm looking at Martin. It was before my time. So there's a huge amount of data out there that Scotland really led the world at the time in producing. Since then, as I said earlier, there's been a lot of movement in this area around the world in the last few years. Automation of algorithms and automation of artificial intelligence has enabled other pieces of technology to come in that could now make a good use of that data that was once generated. So I think it's looking around the world for other examples of where this has been done. So Meat and Livestock Australia have developed a very innovative model. Wales are currently going down the same route. And here in Scotland, we probably have 70% of the work done years ago. And what we really want to get to is what are the metrics that consumers want in terms of the red meat proteins. What has it done for the climate? What's it done for meat eating quality? And is this producing a food product that consumers want to eat and drive demand from that sector, and communicating with the supply chains that we're all taking that forward step together, rather than it saying this is what's right for farmers, but that might not be what's right for processors.
Indeed, and it's a knotty problem of getting the balance right between what the end producer thinks is the best margin for them, and for the primary producer to get the best balance that's right for the animal and the environment and the time to slaughter. So, I mean, I think it's interesting they've got it in here. I'll be interested to see how it leaves it. And I may just leave it there and go to the next question, which is from Richard Lyle. Richard.
Yes, good morning. I maybe should make a declaration. I'm not a farmer, but I was a grocer. So I know what the problems that go on in grocery shops and whatever. Anyway, I believe farming is about food production. Can I say thank you, Martin? You've restored my faith in the comment I made earlier. And in doing so, improving the environment, planting trees, going greener, alleviating climate change. So this bill gives Scottish ministers powers to modify the financial provision in the CAP legislation. And I made an observation earlier about do away with this Pillar 1, Pillar 2. Let's, look at the whole problem and see how we resolve it and help farmers, etc. So There is a legal basis for setting the maximum spend for agricultural support to amend how funds are spent, or to cap how much money has been paid to an individual recipient. What do you think? In what ways should we suggest that the financial provisions in this bill be amended?
Head off on that. Martin, you're definitely looking the other way.
Yeah,
Well, David was obviously the slowest then. So David followed probably by Martin.
Just some clarification. Are you specifically asking about capping?
Well, you know, my view is we've got a system.
Yeah.
That now we are taking back control. I just love that. You know, I laugh every time I say it. But basically, what are we going to do? Do we change the system? Do we keep it the same? Will the law allow us to change the system, or will we still be under the EU system? You know, what is it? Tell me.
So, well, I think we definitely need to change. Definitely, you can't do dramatic change in farming. It's very difficult to impose that. So there definitely needs to be transition, an end point, and a very clear set of direction. But then it's also, you know, the stated intention of the Scottish Government not to leave the EU, and then if we do leave the EU, to rejoin the EU. So we shouldn't move too far away from the EU's Common Agricultural Policy. So this bill is sort of an enabling the current cap, but we should also be, I think it's important to keep an eye on the future cap.
Yeah.
So the future cap has subsidiarity built into it, so each region or member state has, from my understanding, has quite a bit of freedom and flexibility to do what they want. So we can kind of move away, move in our own direction to an extent, and also that it's got much more focus on the environment. So of its, I've got it printed off here somewhere, but yeah, so there are 9 objectives of the future cap: climate change action, environmental care, preserving landscapes and biodiversity are biggies, and it's going to have a higher ambition on environmental and climate action. So preserving carbon-rich soils, obligatory nutrient management tools, and then crop rotation instead of diversification, which under the EFA and the greening wasn't perfect.
So really we should be doing minimal amendments, and basically have you, just to, so to move on, have your views been taken on board by the government in any way? Have you had discussions with the government?
So I think that we can make amendments because the subsidiarity that's built into the future cap. So if we are going to be rejoining the EU, it will allow people to kind of do their own things. In response to the second bit, yes, we submitted a written to the Stability and Simplicity consultation, and I've got that printed off here. I can't remember having specific conversations with ministers around this Stability and Simplicity period.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I certainly agree that we need to continue support in the short term. I think we need a phased approach to a new support model that better incentivises farmers to do what's best for their enterprise and for the environment. The totality of support is obviously an issue in terms of what the Scottish Government chooses to spend on all its different priorities, not just rural, but obviously health, etc., education and so on. So that's a debate for within Cabinet, I would imagine. But you can't neglect the fact that farming in rural Scotland is an important part of the overall economy, and it needs currently at the moment an injection of public support to keep it going. But we do really need to think about designing a new system that better delivers value for money, real value for money, from the support that is directed in that to the agricultural sector.
Thank you.
Okay. Richard, do you have any more questions on that?
Well, I feel as though the excellent witnesses who answered my questions. Thanks.
Okay. So the next question is Angus MacDonald. Angus.
Thank you, Convener. Are you sure?
Oh, hold on. No, Now, this is the second time the clerks have had to pick me up for being wrong, but luckily only once in a meeting. I think I've missed out Peter Chapman. Peter.
I rolled that up with a previous question, so it's okay. My question's answered.
So I was indeed correct. I'll accept the apologies from the clerks later. The next question is from Angus MacDonald. Angus.
Okay, thank you, Convener. If I could turn to the provisions relating to the common organisation of markets. Section 5 of the bill covers modification of CAP legislation on public intervention and private storage aid. And it gives Scottish ministers the power to modify legislation on public intervention and private storage aid, which would allow the government to introduce intervene to support agricultural producers in exceptional circumstances. And of course, we've heard warnings recently of the possibility of a collapse in the sheep or lamb market in the event of a no deal, which is still in the cards. So intervention may be required sooner than we would think. So there's concern with regard to those provisions ceasing in Scotland, particularly with regard to the potential volatility as a result of Brexit. So do you have any thoughts on the provision in the bill which allows Scottish ministers to modify the legislation on public intervention and private storage aid, including by making it cease to have effect?
I'll take this one, I suppose, yeah. It's an important tool to have at your disposal when circumstances require you to exercise it, but it should only be used in exceptional circumstances where there is significant market failure. If we had left the EU at the end of October, then the Scottish sheep trade would have been decimated. Fortunately, we didn't, so that didn't happen. But, you know, it's still there as a threat to the industry, so therefore having powers available, as I said, is a wise move, yeah.
Okay. Anyone else? QMS?
The other element in here is that Scotland's part of the wider United Kingdom, and what happens in England and Wales and Northern Ireland as well in terms of private storage aid would have an implication on what would happen to Scottish farmers. So I would agree with Martin that we absolutely need the provision to be able to intervene should these circumstances, touch wood, they don't happen, ever occur. But also the ability to work with other parts of the United Kingdom to make sure that a Scottish farmer in Dumfries isn't disadvantaged over an English farmer just over the border.
Okay, thanks.
Just before we move on, I just wondered if I could just ask a question. A general question is regarding this bill is, do you think it covers sufficiently food safety, animal welfare and environmental standards within the bill? And do you think that, is there a danger that some are going to slip between the two when this bill comes into power, or are you confident that all those will be maintained at the high standards that hopefully we have at the moment? Martin, do you want to head off?
Yes, certainly. We have other regulatory frameworks in place in Scotland that mirror EU provisions for public health, animal health, etc. So I don't think this bill detracts from, you know, the efficiency of those controls as they're currently applied.
And do you think that you're talking about the industry at the producer end, sorry, at the processor end? Yeah. I mean, are you confident that the producers will continue to meet the standards that the processors require? Yeah,
I mean, primary producers are in their own right are regarded in law as a food business operator these days, and they have certain legal requirements on them, you know, to present their stock fit for slaughter, clean, healthy, etc., etc. If not, there is a whole raft of enforcement officials waiting in the wings to take action. And we have the pleasure of them in our plants every day, unlike other parts of the food supply chain, I might add. So certainly in terms of the meat, the red meat processing sector, we would regard ourselves as highly regulated.
David, are you happy with that?
Yeah, so I'll talk about the environment. So at farm level, I guess there perhaps is a danger that it could slip. Back to this, what's the intent behind this bill and the simplifications and improvements that could be made to get us to wherever we need to go. So the Simplification Task Force put forward some really sensible proposals about more proportionate penalties with ear tags and then things about decimal points of LPIDs. However, the risk is that if you are reducing penalties or changing some of this with cross-compliance, it might set a precedent for some of the really important environmental cross-compliance that we do have, so that you know, whatever happens in 2021, 22, 23, whoever's in power in Scottish Government, whoever the minister is, could then use that precedent to kind of reduce some of the penalties on the environmental side.
Sarah.
I think the only thing I would question, just looking at some of the detail in the bill, is that on page 6, under point 9, marketing standards, agricultural sector, there's a number of different sectors there listed, but pig meat and sheep meat haven't been included. And this relates back to the sectors referred to in sections 8.1a are, then there's a list, but going back to 8.1a, that is linking back to some of the requirement to provide information. So going back to data and being able to enforce and maintain standards, if we don't have information about that coming through, not having sheep and pig meat involved there, that would be a concern for us at Quality Meat Scotland, because we obviously cover the 3 species, beef, lamb and pork. So that's just something that I picked up when I was going through the bill.
That's useful, thank you, and I'm sure we'll follow up on that. The next question then is from Emma Harper. Emma.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everybody. In section 6 of the bill, it talks about the power to simplify and improve CAP legislation on aid for fruit and vegetable producer organisations. And the Angus growers responded to the stability and simplicity consultation. They said the fresh fruit and vegetable aid scheme for horticultural producer organisations is a good model to encourage increased farm business involvement in the food chain. It could be extended to other enterprises. And SAOS, in their submission, they proposed that in the transition period, a new grant scheme is designed and tested on a pilot basis, which grant aids innovation through collaboration. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the provisions in the bill to deal with simplifying and improving CAP legislation for fruit and vegetable producer organisations, and in your view, what might simplify and improve the scheme? What would it look like?
David, you nodded and then stopped nodding.
I can definitely answer a bit of it. I don't have the technical detail, but I think that producer organisations and collaboration and cooperation is incredibly important. I made a point earlier about the price of food and the supply chain asymmetry that we have in Scotland, and I think that there's something really valuable about that collective power. So I think that that should be enabled where possible, and I think that collaborative innovation is a really good thing. In terms of the technical changes that can make to the bill, I don't know the answer to that.
Sarah, you nodded as well.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that, and I think some of the challenges that we've seen in the red meat supply chain, I think producer organisations could definitely help with that, ensuring that the technical legislation is right in that is a key part. And there, at the moment, I think the legislation sits with DEFRA, if I understand correctly, but could be totally wrong, because it's not an area that I'm in any way well versed in. Martin may know more, but I think absolutely would, as I'd agree with anything that increases collaboration and communication within the supply chain.
And Martin, you nodded as well.
Yes,
so.
we are also in favour of greater collaboration, not just across, horizontal, but vertical as well within supply chains. So feeding up from the primary producer to the processor, to the manufacturer, to the retailer. We'd like to see support available to strengthen those links in the supply chain, which would help drive out inefficiencies.
Yes.
It, brings me to maybe a small supplementary, because it's on the back of Maureen's comments about supermarkets. So if we're talking about producers, processors and retailers, it's been suggested to me that milk is a loss leader, and it's been suggested to me that if we put 3 pence on a litre, 1 penny goes to the farmer, 1 goes to the producer, and 1 penny goes to the supermarket. But right now, the dairy farmers are really challenged with the volatility in the milk market. So would this bill help support stabilising that? Because the dairy farmers, 48% are in the southwest of Scotland. How would this bill help support that if we looked at that kind of cooperative approach?
Yes, it would. I'm aware that SAOS helped set up a new producer group in the southwest 3-4 years ago, which has been a great success in terms of improving both the ordinary farmer, the dairy farmer, and they're doing now what we've talked about already, sharing information, best practice, learning from each other, making their business more profitable. They're also able to negotiate with the dairy company from a position of strength rather than individually. So that has been a great success, and we need to see more of that throughout Scotland.
I'm happy to bring you in very briefly, David, because it's quite a specific question of this.
So I'm not sure if legislation is needed in other EU countries. So in France, for example, they've got incredibly powerful co-ops, and I know that the price of milk is much higher than it is here, and it's much more stable. It doesn't have the volatility. So whether, and that's part of the EU and part of the CAP, so whether you need legislation to achieve that is more questionable.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll move on to the next question. Maureen.
I suppose following on from that, the Scottish Government has stated that powers are provided to revoke the EU Food Promotion Scheme following exit, as the Scottish Government can provide the same support via other domestic means. I mean, what are your thoughts on the potential revocation of the EU Food Promotion Scheme, and do you agree that this support can be provided by other means? I suppose that's related to QMS.
Sarah.
So I suppose the nonsense of the current scheme is that you can apply for the EU Food Promotion Scheme as a member state. So at the moment, Scotland can't apply direct, as I understand it, although historically QMS has benefited alongside other organisations from monies here. But I actually do agree that the evidence in would suggest that the Scottish Government have been supporting particularly our marketing activities over the last few years, in particular with the announcement earlier on this year of the £200,000 to supplement the Scotch Lamb campaign, which has been hugely successful. I don't know if anyone was in Glasgow on Saturday and saw the Scotch Lamb naturally to thousands of Argyle Street shoppers. So the evidence would suggest that actually, yes, we can do that without that specific scheme.
Perfect. Martin, do you want to come in on that, or are you?
Yeah, I mean, support for promotion is obviously a good thing, particularly if you have a brand like the Scotch brand to promote and protect. It's a very competitive market out there, so anything you can do to raise your profile with the consumer is obviously beneficial.
Okay. Yeah, more. Yeah.
I think that's fine. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we go on to the next question. Jamie Green. Jamie.
Thank you, Convener. I was on the Isle of Cumbria on Saturday, but I knew they were giving away free lamb in Glasgow. I'd have moved my street stall to there. So, can I ask about marketing standards? If you look at Section 8 of the bill, Sarah briefly alluded to the absence of certain categories, but what Section 8 does is allow Scottish ministers to amend marketing standards for products sold in Scotland. Obviously, that needs to be taken into consideration in the context of any UK agricultural bill, which may or may not be represented when a new government takes office. Do you have any concerns or indeed any comments to make as to this potential divergence of marketing standards in Scotland versus the rest of the UK if the Scottish Government chooses to align itself with EU standards rather than any diverged UK standards?
Martin, that's probably you or Sarah who would like to go first.
Yeah, I think it's could be a double-edged sword, marketing standards, because it can get to a stage where they're too prescriptive and they introduce extra costs for no real benefit. But the other side of that coin is that it gives you uniformity, and you're matching up to the same standards as your competitors, so you're competing on a level playing field.
Sarah, do you want to come in on that?
I think looking at what the technical detail of this means in reality is, again, as I spoke earlier about the ability to amend the Europe grid and bring in specific carcass grading specifications. I suppose what we're looking for in Scotland is to produce products that suit our Scottish consumers, or that we have identified we have an export market for, so we can produce products that market's requirements. Section F refers to, doesn't refer directly to, but would infer the ability to not utilise GMO technology, and that's wherever anyone sits in the two sides of that debate. That would be one area that, if there was a divergent from the UK approach, could cause issues for our Scottish consumers, potentially, again, going back to that supply chain piece and looking at where inputs come in. So, for example, if you're a cattle farmer in Aberdeenshire and you're buying in feed that's being grown or being used with wheat grown in south of the border, and there's a different policy or legislative base in there that does allow for GMO production, that could be a cost to our Scottish farmers. So I think there needs to be a bit of thought there around that specifically and how these areas interact.
Sorry, I'll wait for the microphone. How much of Scottish red meat is sold in Scotland versus sold in the rest of the UK versus sold in Europe? Could you give us some context? Because it's quite hard to picture how these policy, or how a disalignment of policy would affect the market.
I don't have actual statistics on that sort of area for you. Perhaps Sarah does.
Not in my brain that's thinking I could give an honest answer right in front of this committee. It's something I could bring back to you. It's not my area of specific expertise, but from memory, I'm thinking around 80% of produce remains within the United Kingdom. I couldn't say what the split was between.
Helpful for those figures, and say, I mean, if you could let the clerks have them in due course.
Yeah.
Jamie, do you have further questions on this? Because I know Stuart wants to come in.
I think there's more, certainly more lamb goes into Europe compared to beef. I think it's something like 30% of our output, lamb-wise, goes into the European mainland Europe, and it's more likely, I think, 80+% of beef is within the UK market.
Mm.
Sarah, I think those figures would be useful. Jamie,
Yes, and the reason for asking is to just to give it some context, because I think it would be helpful to know if we're looking at the powers that the bill confers upon Scottish ministers in terms of its ability to go in a different direction or to align itself with different standards to that of the UK government, if that would have an effect on Scottish red meat producers' ability to sell into the internal market, which seems to be the largest market at the moment. Can I ask if you were consulted on the provisions of this part of the bill as an industry, and if not, how you'd like to be consulted on these regulations if such changes were looking to be made by the government?
Martin, is that you?
Yeah, we were asked, and we did respond to the first consultation. We've obviously seen the draft bill. We are involved in a variety of stakeholder groups that Scottish Government organise, where issues like this are discussed, and they meet regularly. So I would say that the level of engagement and consultation that we have experienced from Scottish Government has been satisfactory.
Sarah, do you want to add to that?
I would agree with Martin. The QMS are called a non-departmental public body, so we are arm's length from government, but we have been involved in multiple stakeholder groups. We also work directly with ministers at times as well, so I would say that the consultation on this has been adequate, and we will also feed into the written consultation that's live just now.
David, do you want to add anything on the consultation stage?
No.
Okay. Stuart, you wanted to come in, I think.
A very small thing. I just wanted to get on the record that we thought that what Section 8 was doing was setting minimum standards, and that, of course, as we are essentially, as a country, producing products that compete on quality, not on price, that minimum standards help the industry as a whole. And I in particular point at, as I've done elsewhere, Convener, the 1915 Immature Spirits Act, which eliminated whisky that was less than 3 years old from the market and set an international understanding of a quality product. Is that taking us in this kind of general direction?
A brief answer.
It certainly looks like it does, yes.
Okay. And I'm sort of seeing nodding across the group there. The next question is from John Finney. John.
Thank you, Convener. A couple of questions. So maybe just direct the first one to yourself, David. And it's about the issue of organic. Are there implications for organic production, processing and marketing from the provisions of marketing standards, or indeed from any other part of this bill?
So, I don't know. There's an EU regulation that all organic standards are based on. So I guess it comes into the trade agreement and the Croman framework. So it's just uncertain at the moment.
Okay, thank you. I don't know. And for the whole panel, please, then, do you have a view on any implications for consumers of the power for Scottish ministers to change marketing standards that's contained in the bill?
on that? Sarah?
I think, as Martin mentioned earlier, there are other pieces of regulation that specifically work on food safety and food safety regulations. So no, I wouldn't have any concern about consumers. I think this does give us, as I said, particularly with changes to carcass and market classifications, the ability to better produce products that consumers value.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any violent disagreement. John, did you have any further?
No, that's fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next question from Colin Smith. Colin.
Thanks, Convener. It's just a very brief question around the issue of the collection and processing of data. Obviously, Part 2 of the bill includes provisions for collecting and processing agricultural data. I'm just keen to know, do the panel have any particular thoughts on that part of the bill? Does it collect the right data, and is it future-proof, basically?
Martin, collection of data.
Yeah, a laudable objective, but what they're going to do with it, I think, is what's the purpose behind collecting the data? What benefit will it bring? Can you share it with the wider industry so they are able to pick up on best practice? A key feature of the beef efficiency scheme, which is part of the current rural development programme, is the collection of data on DNA and genetics and whatever. But as far as I understand it, that information is currently being analysed, and the intention is to cascade it out, which would obviously be a very good thing. But it just doesn't seem to happen very quickly at all.
Okay, David, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I suppose it's just maybe getting the balance right. You need to collect data, you need to know what's happening, but you don't want to overburden the industry. But at the same time, you want to have data that tells you. So what are the questions you want to ask? The information is then helping to inform the decision making around it.
Sarah.
And again, just in something I know I've already mentioned this, sorry if I'm sounding like a broken record, about communication in the supply chain. So already through their statutory price reporting that QMS makes use of and puts out to industry. So if there was an ability to collect other market information, carcass weights, fat grades, etc., that we could then work with the bodies such as Scotty ID, who are the Scottish, I suppose, farmer data centre, well, to simplify them down to that, that could then work to improve that supply chain communication piece that could be valuable to farmers and to processors as well. And the bill makes provision as well, specifically for the provision of information to persons to whom the information is to be provided, who may be a person other than the Scottish ministers. So I think that makes that clear.
Colin, just on that, just as a thing, I mean, the Farm Management Handbook, which to me always was a useful guide on what the best and the worst were doing across various parts of Scotland, would seem to be a very good way of industry being able to, or farmers to be able to see. Do you think books like that, which allow farmers to understand and producers to understand, or make farmers understand what they want, is a useful way forward? Would you promote things like that?
Absolutely. So QMS provide their enterprise costings year on year, which involves providing data sets of different enterprises at different levels that consultants and other farmers can use as a benchmarking tool. Where I would like to see that move to, so it's more automated. But these are things that you don't necessarily need legislation to do. We can work with individuals and with organisations, and we already do to do that. But it would make things much simpler on a macro scale to get some of those automated data pieces. Talk about automated benchmarking, you would be able to see exactly what farms of similar types, even if they're in a different region or location, because as we all well know, there's no two farms in the same area that will be the same. So being able to compare apples with apples would be really useful, and I think this would enable that, but as long as it is, as I've said, used in the correct way.
You both nodded. David, do you want...
Benchmarking is so important, and it sort of fits into this enabling change piece. So at the end of 2024, where are we going to, what are we wanting to do? We're absolutely wanting to build resilience in the sector. There needs to be an improvement in financial literacy, I would say, and this is a key part of that. And we need to know where the industry is at. We have I used to, as an advisor, collect enterprise costings for the QMS booklet. It probably wasn't the best way of doing it, and I think there's something we could do through provision of data to get a really, really good picture of where farmers are at the moment and how we can get them to build that resilience to get there in future. And benchmarking also includes environmental benchmarking, so let's not just purely think about the economics, let's think about the wider piece as well.
Martin.
Yeah, I'm a city boy, born and bred, so I really don't know farming that well at all, actually. But I'm told that farmers are naturally inquisitive about what their neighbours are up to, so any vehicle or tool or whatever that enables them to find out how they can get better is to be commended.
I'm sure farmers are not competitive and would never try and outdo their neighbour, but maybe that's a point of drawing this session to a close. So I'd like to thank you, Martin, David and Sarah for coming along, giving evidence to this session. The committee is going to go into private session to consider the evidence, so thank you very much, and I close this part of the meeting.